Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. The first Avenger, an anime game, gets cutesy, and the Sega Genesis gets some whip action. I'm your host, Jared, and today is April 29th, 1992. This video is brought to you by Trigon Space Story. Survive the galaxy, keep your crew safe, and be careful with your choices. Trigon Space Story is a space roguelike indie game with real-time tactical battles and nigh infinite replayability. Specialize your crew, outfit your ship, and blast away your enemies. Every single space jump brings new possibilities, as you'll have to make careful decisions that could help or hinder yourself. Every choice carries risk or reward. Move your crewmates to repair damaged parts of your ship and have them man stations for bonuses. Not only that, your crew has specializations and can earn perks as they level up for even further customization and replayability. And if you ever get tired of the game's 4 story campaigns, there is a sandbox mode allowing you to freely explore the galaxy without any limitations. Best of all, there are 0 microtransactions whatsoever. Trigon's developer Gameforge is a group of developers who were such big fans of FTL, they wanted to make another one, but better, and that's exactly what this is. Trigon Space Story is available right now. Click on the link in the description below to check it out, and special thanks to Gameforge for sponsoring this video. Full disclosure, the team here at Now in the 90s strives for our best with our research. However, the early 90s weren't the best archived before the internet. Even with checking, cross-checking, and double-checking, we can only find a game's release month, not the exact date. When that happens, we do our best to approximate the release week. That said, if anyone knows for sure when they were released or has documentation to prove it, please show us in the comments. We would love to see it. Home ports of arcade games were frequent on these retro consoles, especially if it featured money-printing superheroes. One of the biggest of said adaptations was Captain America and the Avengers, first released on the Sega Genesis in April 1992. First released in the arcades back in October of 1991, it's a cooperative beat-em-up with the arcade version featuring 4 players and 4 playable characters: Captain America, Iron Man, Hawkeye, and Vision. Except nobody wanted to play as Vision. It's pretty typical beat-em-up action. Punching enemies, everyone has a ranged attack, and sometimes you throw stuff. Captain America and the Avengers saw a fair number of ports, with the first one being on the NES, but that was more of a platformer. The Sega Genesis was the first one to get an arcade-accurate port more than a year before the Super Nintendo version, and then months after that, it would come to the Game Gear and the Game Boy. However, this is one of those instances where the Genesis version is leagues better than the SNES one. The Sega version looked pretty good, played great, and was still a pretty fun 2-player romp. It even kept the complete nonsense broken English translation. The SNES version may have looked better, but it was straight up missing sound effects, the hit detection was incredibly poor, and all kinds of not fun. So yes, it's true, at least with Captain America, Sega did what Nintendo didn't. By far my favorite thing about Captain America and the Avengers wasn't just playing as my favorite superheroes or even the co-op gameplay. No, my favorite thing about Captain America was that anytime any player took any damage, the game would shout, "No! No! No! Go ahead, try it, it's fun. No! No!" The Genesis got another game this week, and stop me if you've heard this one before. An action platformer where your player character has a whip taking out all kinds of enemies before them. That's right, we're talking about Ernest Evans. You play as Ernest Evans as he goes through several levels of action, whipping everything in the way. And by whipping, I mean going completely bonkers with it. You remember how in Super Castlevania 4, if you held the attack button, you could just jiggle the whip all around? Yeah, it's like that, but the entire game. Even the movements are super awkward. This dude's a better contortionist than he is a whip fighter. This game walked so that Quap could awkwardly fumble. Interestingly enough, there is an explanation for this. Unlike most games, Ernest Evans used multiple interlocking sprites for its player character. Each of his limbs are separately rendered. At the time, this was pretty ambitious. Though, as you can see, it didn't actually work out all that well. It's the kind of thing that tends to fit better for larger sprites. Gameplay-wise, Ernest Evans is a pretty standard action platformer. GamePro considered it to be good, but not exceptional. This game has an interesting history behind it, to put it lightly. For starters, the version that we got was an inferior one. In Japan, Ernest Evans was on the Sega CD, complete with fully voiced anime cutscenes done by Studio Madhouse. In America, the Sega CD wasn't out yet, so it was downgraded to the Genesis. Though aside from the cutscenes and a musical downgrade, it's not massively different. What was massively different was the box art. In Japan, we got the titular character standing there and looking cool at the adventure before him, and in the West, we got Indiana Jones. That is Indiana Jones. It's like the artist heard Guy with a Whip and decided, I am not getting paid enough to try. The story was also changed between the Japanese and the US releases. In the Japanese version, Evans is a treasure hunter recruited to find the Necronomicon. Real-life figures Calvin Coolidge and Al Capone were involved in the plot. In the American version, it's changed to your typical collect the MacGuffins to stop the big bad evil guy. You also play as Evans' grandson, who looks exactly like him. Ernest Evans was the second game in a trilogy, with the first one being El Viento, which was released on the Genesis a year earlier, and the third one being Annette Furutabi, which we never got over here in the West. All three were developed by the studio Wolf Team, who you probably know better for making games such as Tales of Phantasia, Tales of Symphonia, Tales of Vesperia, Tales of Xillia, pretty much almost all of Namco Bandai's Tales of series. The music was also done by Motoi Sakuraba, who you've also heard the music in Golden Sun, Mario Golf, Mario Tennis, and a little game series called Dark Souls. The Genesis release train this week doesn't stop there, as there was also Sid of Valis. Known as SD Valis in Japan, it's more or less a remake of Valis 2, which was originally released on the TurboGrafx CD 2 years prior. The SD standing for Super Deformed, Sid of Valis is less a remake and more a demake. The run and attack gameplay is largely intact, but the original Valis 2 had an in-depth story told through cutscenes that were fully voiced. In 1990, this was the coolest, and unlike most voice acting of the time, it hasn't aged too poorly. As a result, Valis 2 got decent reviews. Sid of Valis, however, did not. The gameplay was made far more simple, and the story lost a lot of its edge. At the time, the chibi art style was considered too childish for us cool gamers, and since it was silly, it was clearly aimed at people already fans of the series. The heroine, Yuko, was also incorrectly named as Sid. As a result, it received mediocre at best reviews from magazines. Remember what I said earlier about games having their box art radically altered for their release overseas? Well, Sid of Valis takes that a step further. While the box art was certainly changed, it's not even Valis anymore. Instead, they reused the box art from a completely different game called Naritori Sogoroku 92, which was a Japan-only release for the PC Engine, or the TurboGrafx 16. Why did they do this? I don't know. Laziness? I'm gonna go with laziness, as evidenced by the fact that the Western release of Sid of Valis' end credits are still in Japanese. This week I counted 3 games released for the Genesis, 1 released for the NES, and 1 released for the Super Nintendo, giving us a very blue-dominant color pie. The biggest release of the week is Captain America and the Avengers, if only due to name recognition from the arcades. Despite being the definitive port, the Genesis version sells for less than all of the other versions of Captain America. The cartridge will cost you just about $20, while a complete copy is just over $70. Ernest Evans didn't gain too much in terms of value. The cartridge by itself shouldn't run you more than $30, and a complete one is less than $70. The biggest gainer of the week is actually Sid of Valis, even if it's inferior to the source. It launched with an MSRP of $59.99, and the cartridge alone is worth $50. And if you got one complete, that easily triples its value. And that's it for today. Next week, we have a super valuable cartoon game, another superhero, and the first TurboGrafx 16 game of this show. I'm your host, Jared, and that was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Be sure to click subscribe if you aren't already. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, especially if you know about any of the games from today's episode. Fun fact about myself, one of the first Sega Genesis games that I ever personally got to play was Valis 3, which was so weird that I got to do that long before Sonic the Hedgehog. No!